They didn't come. Not my mother, not my father, not even my only sister. The church doors stayed open, but the rows that should have been filled with my family were empty. Glaring back at me like a punishment, I stood there in my dress, holding the hand of the man they called the poor farmer, and I smiled. Because if I let myself cry, they would have won. They wanted me humiliated, small, begging them for approval. Instead, I lifted my chin and kissed him in front of everyone. Who stayed? And when the priest declared us husband and wife, I felt something I had never felt at home: peace. It hadn't started that day. My family's judgment had been building for years, layer by layer, wrapped in fake smiles at holiday dinners and whispered gossip about who was worthy of us. My parents built their entire reputation on appearances. The right cars, the right friends, the right neighborhood. And me? I was supposed to marry a man with a business card, not dirt under his fingernails. They measured love in assets. And because my fiancé worked the land, they decided I had thrown my life away. The truth is, they never asked me why I chose him. They never saw the nights he drove, 2 hours after working 12 more just to bring me soup when I was sick. They never saw how he fixed my old car without asking for anything in return. They never saw how he listened, really listened, when I cried about feeling invisible at family dinners, drowned out by their talk of promotions and investments. To them, he was just a man with mud on his boots. To me, he was the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered. So yes, when they skipped my wedding, it cut deep. But standing there, I realized something that changed me forever. Their absence wasn't a loss. It was proof. Proof that I no longer owed them the performance they demanded. Proof that my life was mine, not theirs to stage. And in that silence, surrounded by friends who cheered and clapped, I finally exhaled the weight of their expectations. After the ceremony, when the last guests had left, and the laughter still echoed faintly in the air, I found myself sitting on the wooden steps of the farmhouse we had borrowed for the reception, my dress a little dirty from the grass, my hair coming loose, but my heart steadier than it had ever been. My husband sat beside me, his rough hand covering mine, his thumb brushing gently over my skin, as though reminding me I wasn't alone. I looked out at the wide fields, stretching endlessly into the evening, the sky painted in orange and pink, and thought about the house I had grown up in, a mansion filled with polished marble and silent judgments. It struck me then how empty those halls had always felt, even when crowded with family. At my wedding, they had chosen to make a statement, to show me that in their eyes, I had embarrassed them. I could already imagine the whispers they would spread, that I had betrayed my bloodline, that I had settled beneath myself, that I had married for some misguided idea of love instead of securing a future. But as I sat there, my dress wrinkled and my shoes muddy, I felt richer than I ever had under their roof. It wasn't just about the wedding day. This was the moment my life truly divided into two parts: the daughter who lived under their thumb and the woman who chose her own path. The daughter they had molded would have begged for forgiveness, tried to explain herself, maybe even called home to plead for reconciliation. But the woman I was becoming simply smiled into the twilight and whispered to herself, "Let them talk." Because I knew one thing: time always exposes the truth. And while they clung to their pride and their shallow circles, I was building something real, brick by brick, love by love, moment by moment. The thought of revenge didn't come to me that night, not in the way people might expect. It wasn't about shouting or proving them wrong with words. It was quieter, sharper. My revenge would be living well, thriving in the life they thought was beneath me. My smile, my happiness, my peace. Those would be the things they couldn't stand to see, and deep down, I knew the day would come when they'd look at me, at him, at everything we had built together, and realize what they had thrown away. Weeks passed after the wedding, and not a single phone call came from my family. No congratulations, no message, not even a fake excuse about being too busy. They had erased themselves from my life, as if I were a scandal to be hidden, and, for a while, it stung. But then something shifted. Instead of waiting for their approval, I poured myself into the new life we were creating. Every morning, I woke up in a small house with creaking floors, sunlight spilling across the bed, and the sound of roosters in the distance. It was so different from the polished silence of my parents' estate, and yet it felt alive. I learned to rise early, to help in the fields, to cook meals that came from food we had grown with our own hands. My nails chipped, my dresses grew simpler, and still, I was happier than I had ever been, sipping champagne in a designer gown. Meanwhile, the stories about us spread through town. People whispered that my family had cut me off, that I had thrown everything away. Some pitied me, others admired me, but what none of them knew was how free I felt. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to dress for show or speak carefully to maintain appearances. My husband and I laughed over burned bread, danced, barefoot in the grass when music drifted from a neighbor's house, and counted our money carefully, knowing every dollar mattered. And strangely, that made each small thing precious. A new pair of shoes wasn't just an accessory. It was a victory. A warm meal wasn't just routine. It was proof of our hard work. But then came the first real test of our marriage, and the first crack in my family's pride. A storm tore through the region one summer night, flattening rows of crops and flooding half the farmland. We worked until our bodies ached, trying to salvage what we could. But the loss was devastating. I remember standing ankle-deep in mud, watching my husband's shoulders slump, as though the weight of the world had settled there. My heart broke for him. But I also felt a flicker of fear, because I knew this was the kind of struggle my family had always predicted, the kind they believed proved them right. Sure enough, within days, my mother called. Not to check on me, not to ask if I was safe, but to sneer that this is what happens when you tie yourself to someone beneath you. Her words cut like glass, and for a moment, I almost slipped back into the old me, the one desperate for their approval, desperate to explain that love mattered more than money. But then I caught my reflection in the window, mud-streaked, tired, yet alive, and I realized I didn't need her validation. What she called ruin, I called resilience. What she mocked, I knew was strength. And as she continued her cruel speech on the phone, I calmly ended the call, letting her voice fade into silence. That was the night I decided I would never let their poison touch my life again. Months rolled by, and while my family kept their distance, their absence only fueled me to work harder beside my husband. We rebuilt the damaged fields, row by row, waking before dawn, our hands blistered, our backs aching. But every sprout that broke through the soil felt like a victory we owned together. Neighbors who once whispered about the girl who left her rich family for a farmer began to see us differently. They saw the determination, the way we never gave up, the way we stood shoulder to shoulder, no matter how rough the days became. Slowly, respect replaced gossip, and I noticed how some of the same people who once pitied me now looked at me with quiet admiration. But while our life was mending, my family's perfect image was beginning to crack. I heard through the grapevine that my father's investments had gone sour, that a deal he boasted about at every dinner party collapsed and left him scrambling to maintain his reputation. Suddenly, the same relatives who judged me for marrying beneath myself, were whispering about his failures behind his back. The irony was delicious, though I kept my smile to myself. They had mocked me for choosing love over money, and yet, here I was, standing firm, while their empire built on appearances started to crumble. It wasn't long before the first olive branch appeared, though it was anything but sincere. My sister showed up at our door unannounced, her designer heels sinking awkwardly into the dirt road as she marched up to our porch. She looked me over, like I was a stranger, her eyes scanning my simple dress and the dust on my hands. Then, with a voice dripping with false sweetness, she asked if I might help the family out, since her wedding was coming up and our parents were facing financial difficulties. I almost laughed. The same sister who hadn't bothered to attend my wedding, who hadn't even sent a card, now wanted me to rescue hers from turning into an embarrassment. I listened quietly, nodding as she spoke about how families should stick together in hard times. The same words they had never offered me. When she finally finished, I looked her straight in the eye and told her the truth. Family does stick together, but only when love comes before appearances, and they had made their choice. Her face twisted, shock and anger mixing, as though she couldn't believe I had dared to say no. But I didn't flinch. I wasn't the desperate daughter anymore. I was a woman who had survived storms, rebuilt fields, and built a marriage on real devotion. Compared to that, her demands felt like dust in the wind. And as she left, slamming her car door hard enough to rattle the windows, I felt something I had never felt before when it came to my family: power. Not because I hurt her, not because I rejected her, but because for once, the decision was mine. Not long after my sister's outburst, the calls began, first from her, then from my mother, then even from cousins who had never bothered to speak to me unless there was gossip to exchange. Each message carried the same tone: not warmth, not regret, but entitlement. They insisted that I was still part of the family and therefore had a duty to contribute to preserving our name, as if their pride was more sacred than my happiness. What they didn't know was that while they had been chasing appearances, my husband and I had turned our hard work into something real. The storm that nearly destroyed us had also taught us resilience, and slowly, the farm became profitable again. We sold at markets, expanded into new crops, and by the second year, we weren't just surviving, we were thriving. The irony was painful to them, I'm sure. The daughter they abandoned, the one they pitied and mocked, was now building a foundation stronger than their crumbling mansion. And it wasn't just money, it was respect. People in town began to trust us, to value us, to see us as steady and reliable. My family's empire was built on image, and when cracks appeared, it fell quickly. But what my husband and I had was rooted in the earth itself, and roots don't snap when the surface shakes. The final blow came when my father himself appeared one evening. He drove his luxury car down our dusty road, clearly hating every minute of it, and stepped out with a stiff expression, his pride still clinging to him like a tailored suit. He didn't apologize. He didn't acknowledge the wedding he had missed. He simply said times were difficult and asked if we might consider helping the family out financially. I stood in the doorway, hands still dusted with flour from the bread I'd been kneading, and for a moment, I almost laughed at the absurdity. The man who once told me that love couldn't feed me, that marrying a farmer was throwing away my future, was now standing on that farmer's land, asking me for help. I looked him in the eye and said words I never thought I would have the courage to say. The family you're asking for help, the one that stands with me every morning and every night, is already taken care of, and it doesn't include you. His face froze, pale with shock, And for the first time, I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel fear. I felt free. He muttered something about me regretting this choice, about bridges burned, and then turned back to his car. But I knew as his taillights disappeared into the dark that the bridge had never really existed. They had burned it themselves the day they chose appearances over love. That night, sitting beside my husband, with the smell of fresh bread filling the kitchen, I realized what revenge truly meant. It wasn't about hurting them back. It was about living so fully, so honestly, that their cruelty had no power over me. My happiness, my peace, my love, that was the revenge they would never escape. Years passed, and with every season that turned, the distance between me and my family only grew wider. At first, I thought the silence might ache, that I would feel hollow during holidays or birthdays without their calls. But the truth was, I didn't miss them. I missed the idea of family I had always wished they could be. What I had now with my husband was what I had longed for all along. Laughter that didn't have to be muted. Dinners where love was served in every bite. Mornings where the only expectation was to face the day together. Our farm grew into more than just a livelihood. We added a greenhouse, partnered with local restaurants, and soon our produce became known for its quality. People respected us, not because of a family name, but because of the work we put into every seed, every harvest. Meanwhile, word reached us that my parents' wealth was slipping further. The parties they once threw to dazzle the community grew smaller. The fancy cars rotated out for more practical ones, and the mansion that once gleamed with pride became harder to maintain. Their friends, those who stayed close only for the shine, began to drift away, leaving them exposed. For a family that thrived on image, there was no worse punishment than irrelevance. I didn't have to confront them. I didn't have to shout. Life was doing the work for me, showing them the hollowness of everything they had chosen over love. But life has a way of testing your resolve. Even when you think you're safe, my mother showed up one afternoon, unannounced, her eyes hard, but her voice trembling underneath. She didn't hug me, didn't ask how I'd been. Instead, she spoke of family obligations, again, this time with a sharper edge, hinting that if I didn't step up to support them now, I would be written out completely, erased from inheritance, erased from their name. I stood there in the doorway, my husband's steady presence behind me, and realized she thought she still held power over me. But the truth was, I didn't need their money, their approval, or their name. Everything I was building was mine, us, real. So I told her calmly, erase me if you want. You already did the day you skipped my wedding. Her face tightened. Her jaw quivered. And for the first time in my life, I saw something I had never seen in her before. Not superiority, not judgment, but fear. Fear that she had lost control of me forever. And she was right. She left without another word, her car disappearing in a cloud of dust down the old road. But I knew that would not be the end. My family wasn't used to rejection, and I sensed their next move would not be begging, it would be war. The war came quietly at first. A letter arrived in the mail, thick paper with my father's sharp handwriting, demanding a family meeting to discuss the estate. I didn't reply. Then came the calls, not from them directly, but from relatives I barely knew, pressuring me to attend, warning me that if I stayed away, I'd lose everything, as if I hadn't already lost them years ago. When I ignored those two, they escalated. They sent an attorney, someone in a polished suit, who pulled up our dirt road, looking like he'd stepped onto the wrong stage. He handed me documents, full of legal jargon, claiming debts I didn't owe, obligations I had supposedly inherited. It was intimidation, pure and simple, an attempt to drag me back into their control. but they underestimated who I had become. I sat at our kitchen table, the documents spread before me, and my husband beside me, with his calloused hands folded over mine. I called a lawyer of my own, someone local, someone who knew me not as the daughter of wealthy elites, but as the woman who sold produce at the market every Saturday. We went line by line through those papers, and in the end, the threats crumbled. My parents had nothing solid, nothing real to stand on. Their empire was smoke, and smoke doesn't hold in court. When the case dissolved, word spread fast. People in town heard how my parents had tried to use money and lawyers to pull me back, and how it had failed. For once, I wasn't the subject of pity or gossip. I was the subject of admiration. Neighbors nodded at me with respect. Women pulled me aside to say I had given them courage, that they too were tired of being controlled by appearances or expectations. That was when I realized my revenge was larger than my family. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about breaking the pattern, showing others that you didn't have to bow to bloodlines or money to build a life worth living. And yet, despite all this, my parents weren't finished. Pride is a stubborn beast, and theirs was too large to die quietly. One evening, my father himself came again, but this time his voice wasn't cold. It was desperate. He admitted that they were drowning financially, that the mansion might be sold, that the name they had guarded like a crown was slipping through their fingers. For the first time, he asked, not demanded, for help. I stood in that doorway, the same doorway where my mother had once threatened me, and I felt a strange calm settle over me because I finally understood. I didn't owe them anything, not my money, not my loyalty, not my silence. I told him softly, "You taught me that appearances mattered more than love. I chose love. And look at me now. I have everything you never gave me." His face cracked, not with anger this time, but with something that looked like regret, maybe even shame. But regret doesn't erase years of cruelty, and I wasn't about to let his moment of weakness pull me back into the cage I had broken free from. That night, after he drove away into the dark, I sat with my husband by the fire, the smell of wood smoke and fresh bread filling the air. I realized that my revenge had already happened, not in the form of screaming matches or lawsuits, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that I had built a life stronger than anything my family's money could ever buy. And that truth, I knew, would haunt them more than any words ever could. The seasons turned again, and by the time we reached our 5th anniversary, our farm had become something bigger than we ever imagined. What started as a few acres of struggling crops had grown into a thriving business, one that supplied local restaurants, attracted visitors from nearby cities, and even caught the attention of regional distributors. We hired workers from the community, gave jobs to people others had written off, and built something that mattered. Every time I looked at what we had created, I thought about that empty row of seats at my wedding. The people who should have cheered me on had abandoned me, but strangers had become allies. Neighbors had become family, and love had become the foundation of everything. It was around that time that I heard the news. My parents had put the mansion on the market, the very house they had guarded so fiercely. The palace they once claimed proved their superiority was being shown to strangers. I drove past it once, out of curiosity, and saw weeds creeping up through the driveway, paint chipping from the shutters, and the once glorious fountain in the front yard, standing dry and cracked. It was like staring at a ghost, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel triumph. I just felt distance. That world wasn't mine anymore, and I didn't want it back, but they weren't done trying. When the sale went through and they downsized into a modest home, they reached out again, this time through my aunt, who showed up at the market one morning while I was arranging baskets of fresh produce. She told me my parents were humbled, that they missed me, that they wanted to start fresh. Her words might have moved me years earlier, but by then, I could see them clearly. They didn't miss me. They missed the power they had over me. They didn't want fresh starts. They wanted me to be their safety net. I smiled politely, thanked her for delivering the message, and went back to serving my customers. Because my life was full, my heart was steady, and I had no room left for their manipulations. The ultimate twist of fate came a year later, when my sister, still living in that shallow world of appearances, faced her own crisis. Her husband's business collapsed, and suddenly the woman who once sneered at my simple dresses and muddy shoes was standing in front of me, eyes red, asking for help. For a moment, I saw the girl she used to be, the sister I had once loved, before our parents poisoned everything with pride. Part of me wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but then I remembered my own wedding day, the empty seat with her name on it, the silence when I needed her most. So I told her the truth. I can forgive you, but I can't save you. You'll have to learn to build the way I did, starting from nothing. Her tears fell, but I didn't waver, because I knew then that the strongest revenge was not vengeance at all. It was boundaries. By the time I walked back into my farmhouse that evening, my husband waiting with dinner on the table and laughter ready on his lips, I realized I had come full circle. I had traded wealth for love, image for truth, and in that trade, I had won more than my family could ever understand. They had skipped my wedding to punish me. Instead, they freed me, and that freedom was the sweetest victory I could ever imagine. Years later, when people in town spoke my name, it wasn't with pity anymore. They didn't whisper about the girl who had been abandoned by her wealthy family, or speculate about whether I regretted leaving it all behind. Instead, they talked about the farm, about the quality of our produce, about the community projects we supported, about how we turned a piece of land into a foundation that gave back more than it ever took. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving in a way that could never be measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. And every time I heard someone say how proud they were of us, how much they respected what we had built, I thought back to that wedding day, to the empty chairs that once broke my heart, and I smiled. My family's downfall had been steady but undeniable. Their name no longer carried weight in social circles. Their invitations stopped arriving at the exclusive galas they once lived for, and their mansion was nothing but a memory. I sometimes caught sight of my parents around town, older, now, faces lined not just by age, but by bitterness. They never looked me in the eye. Maybe shame kept them silent, or maybe pride still gnawed at them too much to admit they had been wrong. Either way, I no longer needed their apology. I had made peace with their absence long ago. What I hadn't expected, though, was how many women quietly began coming to me with their own stories. Some were neighbors, some were strangers, but they all carried the same theme. They too had been told to sacrifice happiness for appearances, to marry for money, to bury love under the weight of family expectation. They looked at me as proof that another path was possible, that walking away from a gilded cage didn't mean falling into ruin. It meant freedom. And in their eyes, I saw pieces of the girl I had once been. Desperate for permission to choose herself, I gave it to them, not with grand speeches, but with honesty. I told them what it cost me, how much it hurt to stand alone, how deep the scars of rejection could go. But I also told them what it gave me: peace, joy, love, and a life no one could take away. And maybe that was my truest revenge, not against my family, but against the poison they represented. By refusing to let their values dictate my worth, I had not only saved myself, but lit a path for others. I never needed to see them ruined, never needed to stand over their broken pride. Their punishment was simple and unchangeable. They would have to live the rest of their lives knowing they skipped the most important day of mine. And in doing so, they lost me forever. One evening, sitting on the porch with my husband, the sky awash in gold, as the sun set over the fields, he asked me quietly if I ever thought about them, if I ever missed them. I leaned my head against his shoulder and told him the truth. No, I said, because I have everything I ever needed right here. And as the crickets began to sing and the day slipped into night, I realized once more that the smile I wore on my wedding day wasn't for them. It was for me. By the time a decade had passed, the life my husband and I built no longer felt like a rebellion against my family. It simply felt like home. The farmhouse had been expanded. The land doubled, and our names carried weight, not because of inherited prestige, but because of trust we had earned. Children ran through the fields now. Our children, laughing as they chased one another between rows of corn and sunflowers. Every time I looked at them, I knew I had broken the cycle. They would never grow up measuring their worth in money or fearing rejection if they chose love. They would grow up knowing that home was where they were wanted, not where they had to beg for space at the table. It was during a town fundraiser, one summer evening, held in a converted barn, strung with lights, that I encountered my parents again. They looked smaller somehow, not just older but diminished, as if time and loss had hollowed out their grandeur. They avoided me at first, lingering near the edges, but eventually my mother approached. Her voice was softer than I remembered, tinged with exhaustion. She asked about the children, about the farm, even about my husband. It almost felt normal, almost like the way it could have been, until she slipped back into old habits, suggesting that perhaps it was time to come back into the family, to reclaim the place I had walked away from. For a moment, I studied her, really looked at her. This was the woman who had once sneered down the phone as our crops drowned, the woman who skipped my vows, the woman who believed appearances were more important than love. And though she looked frail, though she sounded tired, I knew she hadn't changed. She still saw me as an extension of her pride, a piece of her legacy, not as a woman who had carved her own. So I smiled politely, thanked her for asking, and told her simply, I already have a family, and they're right here. Her eyes glistened, whether with anger or with something closer to sorrow. I couldn't tell, but she walked away without another word, and I let her go without regret. My children tugged at my dress then, demanding I dance with them under the string lights, and as their laughter filled the barn, I realized just how far I had come. Revenge, I finally understood, wasn't fire and fury. It was freedom. It was standing in the middle of a life they said would ruin me, and knowing I had never been stronger. It was watching my children grow in love, watching my husband's eyes still soften every time he looked at me, and knowing that their absence had never been a loss. It had been the gift that allowed me to build all this, and as the music played, as I twirled barefoot on wooden floors, I smiled the same smile I had worn at my wedding, the smile they thought was weakness. Only now I knew it for what it was, the beginning of everything. Years later, when the farm had grown into a landmark and our children were nearly grown themselves, I heard that my parents' health was failing. For a moment, I wondered if I should go, if closure meant standing at their bedside, offering words I never truly received from them. But then I remembered every empty seat, every cruel remark, every attempt to drag me back into chains I had broken. Closure didn't live in their house. It lived here, in mine, so I stayed. I baked bread with my daughters. I taught my son how to repair a fence. I kissed my husband in the quiet of the morning, and I let time take care of the rest. When news finally came that my father had passed, I didn't shed tears. I had grieved the loss of my family long ago, on the day they chose pride over me. At the funeral, I stood at the back, not to be seen, not to make a statement, but to remind myself that I had survived it all. My mother never looked at me. My sister gave only a brief nod, and I realized with stunning clarity that their world and mine were forever divided, and that was fine. I didn't need their approval to validate my life. My presence there wasn't for them. It was for me, to mark the end of something that had once held me captive. Driving home afterward, I passed the old mansion once more, now sold to strangers who had painted over the past and filled it with their own lives. The fountain was working again, the weeds were gone, and children's toys were scattered across the lawn. It no longer belonged to my family, and somehow that felt right. Their legacy had vanished, replaced by something living and real. Just as I had replaced my chains with love, so too had the house found new meaning in new hands. That night, on our porch, I sat beside my husband as the stars came out. Our children's laughter drifted through the open windows. Mingling with the soft hum of the crickets, I thought back to that young woman in a white dress, standing in front of empty chairs, her heart breaking as her family abandoned her. If I could speak to her now, I would tell her, "Don't fear this pain. It will free you," because that smile she wore, that fragile act of defiance, was the seed of everything that followed. My family skipped my wedding to shame me, but all they did was set me free. And freedom, built on love and resilience, is the sweetest revenge of all. I sometimes wonder if my family ever sits alone in the quiet of their smaller homes, staring at the walls that no longer echo with praise, thinking about what they gave up, not the money, not the mansion, not the image they worked so hard to preserve, but me, their daughter, their sister, their blood, the one who stood waiting at the altar, looking for faces that never appeared, and chose to smile instead of break. Maybe they remember that moment and think I was naive, a fool for choosing a man with calloused hands and muddy boots over a future paved with gold. Or maybe, just maybe, they understand now that the very thing they dismissed as weakness became the foundation of my strength. Because while they clung to appearances until those appearances crumbled, I built a life that could withstand storms, that could grow roots in the earth, that could expand and bloom long after their empire turned to dust. There were times when anger tempted me, when I imagined showing up at their gatherings in fine clothes, my children well dressed, my business thriving, just to watch their faces fall, but I never needed to. Life did the work for me. Their downfall wasn't loud. It wasn't spectacular. It was slow, a steady erosion of everything they thought would last forever. And my rise wasn't glamorous either. It was built in sweat and laughter, in mornings before sunrise and nights, falling asleep, exhausted but content. That's the part they'll never understand. Real wealth isn't measured in estates or bank accounts. It's measured in peace, in the kind of joy that can't be faked, in the love of people who choose you every single day. If there is one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that revenge doesn't always look like victory speeches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes revenge is quieter, softer. It's in the way you keep walking when others expect you to crawl. It's in the way you smile through betrayal and turn that smile into the beginning of something unbreakable. It's in raising children who will never doubt their worth, who will never beg for a seat at a table where love is conditional. It's in sitting on a porch at sunset, your partner's hand warm in yours, and realizing you don't need anything more. My family once told me that choosing love would ruin me. They skipped my wedding to prove their point, to teach me a lesson, but the lesson belonged to them. Because every year since that day, I have grown stronger, freer, happier. They missed the chance to witness it, to be part of it, and that is their punishment. My life is not just my revenge, it is my victory. So when I think back to that church, to the empty rows where their faces should have been, I don't feel sorrow anymore. I feel gratitude. Their absence gave me clarity. Their rejection gave me freedom. Their silence gave me peace. And that smile I wore at the altar, the smile they mistook for weakness, turned out to be the first step toward the greatest triumph of my life. Because I didn't just marry a poor farmer. I married the man who gave me the world. And in choosing him, I chose myself. That choice will always be my sweetest revenge.